Welcome back in. Today we're discussing some of my favorite running backs with really big upside for this week. Let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to start things off with Achane. He's currently averaging about 12.1 carries and 5.6 targets per game. He's 12th in red zone touches. Now, he is only 25th in rushing yards this year, but he is first in receptions and receiving yards, ninth in touchdowns, and averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game. Now, his massive target share that he's seeing, which is second highest among all running backs, is one of the biggest reason why he has been so productive this year, because he really hasn't been as good on the ground as we've seen like it last year. Now, I think some of that's because of more volume than what he saw last year. But he's still averaging 5.2 yards per touch, and he's eighth in yards created per touch. But the massive target share he's seeing is keeping him afloat every single week. So those are obviously things we love to see from him. And also, he gets a really good matchup. I think that sets up really well with the skill set, and that is a matchup against the Cleveland Browns, because since week 11, the Browns have allowed the seventh most rushing yards, the fourth most touchdowns, the eighth highest explosive run rating, the seventh highest missed tackles forced per attempt, and a 2.27 yards before contact per attempt, which also ranks top 7. So I really like this spot for Achane. Achane has really been the engine of this entire offense this year. While we've seen guys like Tyreek Hill really struggle this year and not put up the type of numbers we typically see, Achane has definitely been the one dude outside of Jonnu Smith that you can count on a week-to-week basis. So let's keep it moving here. We're going to move over to my next one, and we're going to hit on Kyren Williams versus Arizona. Now, Kyren has been kind of the opposite of Achane, where he's averaging 20.2 carries per game, 2.6 targets per game. He's third in rushing yards, but 40th in receiving yards. He does have 15 touchdowns this year, which is second most among all running backs, and averaging 17.1 fantasy points per game, which is 10th among all running backs. Now, his 7% target share, 26% route participation is obviously not what we want to see. He hasn't been efficient whatsoever with his touches. 3.9 true yards per carry, ranks 45th, and he's 40th in explosive run rate and 52nd in yards created per touch. He just hasn't been efficient with his touches this year. Now, he is seeing a really large workload, so it's obviously going to be a little bit tougher for those guys to be as efficient. But like we say, opportunity is always king in fantasy football, and this is exactly a perfect example of that. This is a player that's handling 78, 80% of the rush attempts every single week. And it doesn't really matter that he's not being as explosive as we'd like him to be, as long as he's going to continue to see this type of volume. And he gets a very good matchup this week against the Arizona Cardinals. Since week 11, the Cardinals have allowed 133.6 rushing yards per game, a 5.10 yards per carry, which is the fourth highest rate in the league, and 6 rushing touchdowns. They also have the highest explosive run rate allowed and the 5th highest missed tackles forced per attempt and yards after contact per attempt. So this matchup sets up really well for Kyren Williams. Obviously, the Rams are still fighting for a playoff spot, and so this is a team that's definitely going to be engaged. And so I really like this spot for Kyren Williams. I think another big day is upon us with Kyren Williams. Let's keep it moving here. We're going to move over to Jonathan Taylor, who had a monster day this past week. With Jonathan Taylor, again, very similar situation to Kyren Williams, just is not that involved in the passing game. But he is seeing a 90% opportunity share that is first among all running backs, averaging 19.8 carries per game and only 2.3 targets per game. He's averaging nearly 100 rushing yards per game, but only 11 receiving yards per game. He does have 9 touchdowns and is averaging 16.2 fantasy points per game. Now, on a per-touch basis, he's been really good. 10th in explosive run rate, 18th in evaded tackles. But like I said, coming off this monster game against the Titans, where he racked up 218 yards and 3 touchdowns for 40 fantasy points. And he gets a phenomenal matchup again this week against the Giants, who are allowing 133.6 rushing yards per game and 8 touchdowns since week 11. They're also second yards after contact per attempt and the 9th highest missed tackles forced per attempt, and allowing the 4th most PPR points position this season. So this sets up really, really well for Jonathan Taylor. I think he smashes again this week. And if you are able to make it through with Jonathan Taylor into the fantasy playoffs, you are very, very happy right now, because I think he's going to smash in the fantasy championship week. Let's keep it moving here. We're going to move on to Zach Charbonnet, who played Thursday night against the Bears. Now, it doesn't sound promising whatsoever for Kenneth Walker, who again is hurt with an ankle injury. It sounds highly unlikely he'll be ready to go in time for their next game on Thursday. So this means Charbonnet will once again be the bow cow in this backfield. In the games Walker has missed, Charbonnet is averaging 15.5 carries, 5 targets, 108.7 total yards per game, 1.5 touchdowns, and 24 fantasy points per game. On the season, he's second elusive rating, 24th in explosive run rate, 16th in evaded tackles, and 7th in yards created per touch. So he's been very good when given opportunities, and they get one of the best matchups you can get in recent weeks against running backs, and that is the Chicago Bears. Since week 11, they're allowing 135.8 rushing yards per game, the second most rushing touchdowns, and the eighth highest yards before contact per attempt. So Zach Charbonnet, as long as Kenneth Walker misses, and it really does sound like he will. They estimated it was not practiced on Monday. Now we're supposed to get an update on Tuesday on Christmas Eve on this imaging that he got done on his ankle. But with them playing so quickly on Thursday, I'm highly, highly skeptical that Kenneth Walker will play. So wheels up for Zach Charbonnet again. Next up, let's move over to Bucky Irving against the Panthers. Bucky Irving has been an absolute stud this year. He has been featured just about every week we have done one of these shows. I'm curious to see where he's drafted next year because he deserves to be drafted among the top 12 running backs next year. Despite only handling 11.2 carries, 2.9 targets per game, Bucky Irving has amassed 1,200 total yards and 7 touchdowns, and he's averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game. He ranks top 6 in yards per touch, 7th in explosive run rate, and 4th in yards created per touch. Now, this week, they get a rematch against the Panthers this week. Last time these two teams faced, racked up 185 total yards and a touchdown for 27.5 PPR points. Bucky is an absolute smash play again this week. Absolutely love Bucky Irving. Another late round gem for this year. Let's keep it moving. We're going to move over to Tony Pollard against the Jaguars. Last week was a really frustrating game for Pollard, who totaled 40 total yards on 10 total touches. We have seen Pollard slip recently as he scored 9 or fewer fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. But on the season, he's still handling 73% of the opportunities, 15.9 carries and 3.8 targets per game. He has racked up 1,000 rushing yards, 238 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns, averaging about 13 fantasy points per game. With a 12.9% target share. He's 14th in highest route participation, 28th in yards per route run. Now, on the ground, he's been pretty good too. 14th in explosive run rate, 13th in yards created per touch. Now, this week, he gets a great matchup against the Jaguars, who are allowing the 13th most rushing yards per game, the 7th most touchdowns, the 7th lowest stuff rate, and the 9th highest explosive run rate allowed. So this sets up as a really good matchup for Tony Pollard this week. And so I think he bounces back in a pretty good way. Now, last week, they were pretty much game scripted out because they fell behind big time in that game. We saw a little bit more Tajay Spears down the stretch as they were trying to claw back into it in that game. But I think this matchup sets up much better for them. I think this is a game that they can control a little bit more and a game that where Tony Pollard could probably see a lot more touches. So I think this is a really good bounce back spot for Tony Pollard. Now, I want to hit on a few flex options for people that are maybe making some decisions this week. First, I want to talk about the Giants situation. Tyrone Tracy appeared to re-aggravate his ankle this past weekend, and his status for Week 17 is unknown. What we do know is this upcoming matchup sets up really well for the backfield. The Colts have allowed the 7th most PPR points to running backs this season. So if Tracy's able to play this game, I'm firing him up. Top 24 running back play. But if he misses, I think you can pretty much expect a similar production from Devin Singletary. So I do think Singletary is also in a good spot here if he did not play. So if you have either one of these guys, I think these guys are really good flex options for this week. Next up is going to be the Jaguars running backs. The Titans' run defense is absolutely cratered since week 11 as they have allowed the 2nd most rushing yards, the most rushing touchdowns. They have the 9th lowest stuff rate, the 11th most yards before contact per attempt. But I think both Bigsby and ETN are in play in this game against the Titans. So I do like Tank Bigsby more than Travis Etienne just because he tends to be the early down back and somebody that's going to get some of those opportunities. But I also think you could probably play Travis Etienne if you had to as well. Let's move over to Alexander Mattison, who's coming off a pretty good performance in Week 16 against the Jags, where he rushed 12 times and was targeted 7 times. He finished with 56 total yards and a score for 15.6 fantasy points last week. Next up is another very good matchup against the Saints defense that has yielded the 11th most PPR points to the running back position this year. So I really do like playing Alexander Mattison as a flex play. And some injury notes, J.K. Dobbins, he had his practice window opened up today. Depending on his Week 17 status, if Dobbins is able to go, he should regain his lead back role. And he gets a great matchup against the Patriots, who have allowed the 8th most PPR points to running backs this season. And then lastly, Isaac Guerendo. Shanahan said on Monday that they expect Guerendo to practice on Thursday. While this isn't the best matchup, the Lions have started to struggle recently against opposing running backs as they have allowed 4.5 yards per carry, which is the 14th highest rate in the league, and their 7 touchdowns ranked 7th most over that span since Week 11. So I think Guerendo is probably a top 20 running back for me. I think when he comes back, he is definitely going to slot himself right back in as that lead back. Patrick Taylor did absolutely nothing, not surprising. And so I do think Isaac Guerendo makes for a top 20 running back play, so maybe top 15 running back play this week. So